Okay. Dr. Hannah Sassi, welcome.
Thank you.
We're live. Thank you so much for coming on short notice. I know your colleague, Dr. Kim, had some personal issues, so super appreciate it.
Of course.
Can we start with you? A little bit about, you're obviously from America, that people are going to quickly catch on to.
Yes.
Big, bolsterous American voice. But just why you got into this field, what study you did, what brought you to Australia, why Sydney University, and don't be scared of that microphone.
Okay. So I got into food safety from my undergraduate degree in public health. And I just kind of developed.
Which you did in Arizona?
Yes, at the University of Arizona. So I did all my studies at the University of Arizona in Tucson and was really interested in environmental health. So I did a lot of courses on environmental water quality and some like environmental physics and, where you look at weather and climate. And then I decided I wanted to keep going. And then I did a master's in environmental health. And that's when I got into microbiology. So my advisor, she had gotten her PhD under a professor who was still there. And so I did my studies with him for my master's and then just continued on for my PhD. And it all kind of went hand in hand when you looked at environmental health and environmental microbiology, and these kind of converge.
What's the difference between the two?
Or at food safety.
What's the difference between environmental health, environmental
microbiology?
Microbiology.
So microbiology is just focusing on microbes, so bacteria, viruses, parasites, algae, archaea, the little tiny guys that you can't see.
Yeah.
Whereas environmental health is, so I would say maybe environmental microbiology can sometimes fall under environmental health, but sometimes environmental health can fall under microbiology.
Yeah.
So environmental microbiology isn't always about pathogens. It isn't always about things that make you sick. But environmental health isn't always about microbiology. So we look at other stuff like arsenic contamination in water, lead, any sort of toxin exposure, air pollution, so anything in the environment that you would be exposed to, so not just microbiology.
Yeah. And without getting right into your PhD, was it alarming what you discovered about the health of our environment, or was it kind of tempering to the sensationalism that goes on with environmental health?
I think it depends on the context when you think about it. So some things you really take for granted, like the quality of your food, the quality of the water that you drink. Sydney has amazing tap water, and we just drink it right out of the tap.
Yeah.
But in environmental health in your studies and then in your actual practical research, you realize that's not the case everywhere. And so that is a little kind of like in your face, where you see these people that are drinking water that has all these heavy metals in it, and they're feeling the consequences years later. Even
within first world countries?
Yeah. So Flint, Michigan is a good example. I mean, we've been hearing about their water quality for years, and they just can't correct it. There's people in mining communities who are they're having all this runoff into their water systems, and those videos of people lighting their water on fire.
True.
And it's hard to fix it.
Yeah, no, I get it.
So that was definitely like an abrupt thing, because in, developed countries, you think, oh, it's so nice. Everyone has this lovely standard of living and this water that we have and, access to healthy, safe, clean foods. And so it's just not the case. And I think that was something that was really, I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah. It's interesting. I watched, coming back from the US on Sunday night last week, True Cost, which is that documentary around the fashion industry and fast fashion. And most of it was centered on the human abuse of third world countries that make all the garments for H&M and Zara and those kind of places. But then they brought it back home to the US for you, to Texas, where most of the cotton in the world is grown. And the number of farmers that die from brain tumors and brain disease before the age of 50 because of this incredible herbicide and pesticide that's sprayed on virtually every crop of cotton that's ever grown, and it's a dire problem. In rural communities.
A lot of times with stuff like that, the regulators don't think about people who are going and actually encountering the cotton every single day. They're only thinking about pesticides are really heavily regulated, especially on like food crops. But then there are certain pesticides that you can use on stuff like cotton that you can't use on food crops because they are known to have these detrimental effects to health, or they're suspected to. So that's a big thing in the U.S. A lot of pesticides and chemicals, they have these suspected issues, but they're not necessarily scientifically proven, but they're not proven.
A bit like the whole Roundup thing with Monsanto.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
So these people are in they're being exposed to these chemicals in a different route.
Yeah.
So whether it's through their skin or breathing it in, it's not necessarily that ingestion that we always think of.
Get it. Can we talk about food safety and maybe back to first principles? Because I think, the average listener on this show is, I would dare say, very savvy and reasonably scientific, but bringing it back to first principles from a scientific perspective, what do you define as food safety?
So, as a first principle, that's a big question. But I would say food safety is really just, from a public health background, you always think about it as risk. So there's never something that has no risk. Yeah. Every activity has a risk, but it's whether it's acceptable or unacceptable. So that's kind of how we think of risk terms.
Yeah.
And so food safety is basically about lowering that risk to as low as humanly possible, because food is an exposure route that we're never going to get rid of. Yeah. Everyone has to always eat. Everyone has to drink water. So it's an obligatory risk. Yeah. You can't avoid it. So it's kind of up to us to make those risks as minimal as possible.
Yeah.
And so that includes chemicals, microbiological risks, foreign bodies like, metal and, Band-Aids. And there was a bagged salad with a bat in it a few years ago in the US. So it can be anything. But food safety is really just about protecting that food source as it's being grown, as it's being packaged, and as it's being prepared.
Yeah, so that
to minimize the risk to the consumer falling ill. Yeah.
Okay, get it. In terms, though, of the risk, whatever the reasonable tolerance is, acceptable tolerance is, what's reasonable and what's unreasonable? Because there seems to be this conflicting desire for people continually, a bit like the fashion industry, where people are continually demanding cheaper food, and yet they're continually demanding less risk when it comes to food. And those things seem to be mutually exclusive to me.
Yeah. So unfortunately, that is the case. It's not free to have food safety program. People need to do research. People need to do QA and QC monitoring in plants, and on farms, we need agronomists to take samples. And so it really is, it's a whole chain. It's not just about, I don't want to pay, $2.50 for a head of cause. I want to pay $1.50.
Yeah.
It depends on, the supply chain. Where does this piece of lettuce come from? How is it grown? What's used on it? How is the water decontaminated? How is it decontaminated? So it's a whole process. And so I think that there's that fine balance between keeping costs acceptable and keeping risk acceptable. And so just because something is less expensive than something else, it doesn't mean that it holds a higher risk.
Yeah, get it.
Necessarily. So I think that's something a lot of people think about too. Like, I paid so much for this, and that's unacceptable that there would be an outbreak. But usually it's environmental factors that we can't really control. And so I would say for the most part, food safety programs are pretty thorough. We're in the 21st century, and we have a lot of technology, and there's been so much research that we can kind of start to understand how pathogens contaminate things, or how chemicals affect the body of people who eat them or come into contact with them when they're working. So, just because something's cheaper doesn't mean it's
more risky,
less safe. Yeah.
But do you think people truly understand? Like, you take we're having this constant debate around whether vegetarianism and veganism is healthier than being an omnivore or a carnivore. And, but there seems to be this misunderstanding of crops in particular, the amount of herbicides and pesticides applied to them, let alone the years of stuff that's leached into the soil and what goes actually into feeding those plants. Does food safety actually cover that? Like, do the governing bodies in this country and in the US actually go that deep into looking at plants from a risk perspective insofar as those chemical things that happen at the farm?
So yes and no. So there are, I know of in the US, regulations against using certain chemicals because they're internalized through root systems in certain plants. So tomatoes internalize things pretty readily. Spinach, other leafy greens that are grown close to the ground, they do as well.
Meaning that they'll
take something,
the poison into the plant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if it's mixed in, so a lot of times starting out, they'll mix things into water and they'll flood irrigate or a constant drip irrigation just to kind of get that, whether it's fertilizer or supplements that are going into the soil or an herbicide. It just depends, insecticides, anything. And so it sometimes starts out in water. And so then that's soaked into the soil and that can be leached up in through root systems. And so we find that a lot with bacteria too. But so there are regulations posed around those issues. But the problem is a lot of this research is pretty old too. So it's about continuing research and updating, and we're getting new herbicides and insecticides all the time. So it's about measuring
better
those risks.
Or new?
New. We don't know if they're better yet. And so, but
arguably and intrinsically probably not.
Exactly. And so we have biocides as well, which is kind of like some sort of biological organism that's been adapted to work as a pesticide or an herbicide or an insecticide. And so a lot of times, there's one case in cotton, Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacteria. It's been basically kind of modified, but not genetically modified. It's just had it's just been
the
cultured.
Cotton seed itself.
So the bacteria, it has acted as a biocontrol. And so it's spread when the cotton's being seeded, and it's supposed to prevent, aspergillus, which is a fungi that is really bad. It gets on a lot of our cotton and wheat and drier crops. And it sporulates. And so it causes irritation in your respiratory system, but it also produces toxins. And so this bacillus, it's called BT. It's a treatment that's made from a bacteria that prevents the growth of this fungi. And so it's called the biocontrol. And so I think that's where a lot of the research is headed, is towards biocontrol, because people are really against the use of chemicals in their food. Like the more that information is becoming available, the more people are kind of finding out about how things are done, or, what ingredients are in fertilizers or pesticides, and they just don't like the idea of it. Not necessarily it's bad. They just don't like that idea.
But it's such a omnipresent problem. Like, you look again using the US because it's such a good case study with Monsanto that owns everything from 98% of the seeds that are grown through to all of the herbicides and pesticides that are grown to treat the bacteria and things on those seeds. It must be nearly impossible for people that aren't buying organic produce or free-range produce to avoid that problem. And that's less than 1% of the population.
Yeah, well, even organic produce or an organic meat, they still have pesticides. It's just at a much lower level.
Yeah, interesting.
So, and then certain chemicals aren't approved for usage. But you go to these huge farming areas in the US, and, organic produce is farmed up from regular produce, and they're all using the same water.
Yeah.
So you have to think about the environmental aspect as well, because you can't separate out water. This is for organic and this is for conventional.
It's like the old smoking at that side of the restaurant, non-smoking
exactly.
here. Yeah,
so
get it.
That's what you always have to think about too. And so there's never going to be a fresh produce item, or probably even a food item that hasn't had some sort of chemical applied
or ingested.
Yeah. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad for you. It just is something that people need to think about, especially what happens a lot is allergens. That's how allergens can be applied to fresh produce as well, and any sort of during any sort of farming procedure. So it's just something that people should be aware of, that just because you're buying organic doesn't mean
you're not getting any of the nasties.
Yeah. It just is usually at a lower level, and certain types of pesticides are excluded.
Sounds hard. The governing bodies, are they practical typically? And let's talk about Australia now. I'm assuming they're all government organisations.
So actually, this was pretty interesting to me when I moved here. Fresh produce is not really regulated federally, but more so through private auditing systems. And so
at a state level.
Yeah. And so, I mean, yes, I think there was a push to make kind of like so the Food Safety Modernization Act is what's going on in the US right now. And so a few years back, there was a push for Australia to kind of start developing its own similar piece of legislation for fresh produce. And so I think they had a few committee meetings, and they started to outline it, but it was just such a huge undertaking, and things were working well here without it. So they've kind of put it on hold, but there is talk of revisiting it now. But for now, most farmers are really regulated by what auditing system they're on.
Yeah. And it typically is at a state level.
I think it depends. So
does matter, yeah.
Yeah, it depends there's Fresh Care, that's a huge one, and they're national, and they do a really good job. They're very thorough. They have water, they have to test their water, and they have to test it within 48 hours of X. And so, and then Kohl's and Woolies and Harris Farms, all the retailers, they have their own criteria as well. And so usually what the auditing companies, programs will say is, if you comply with us, you comply with Kohl's, Woolies, and Harris Farms, you can sell to anyone.
Yeah.
So it is reinforced by that in that supply chain where grocery stores aren't going to buy your produce unless it's approved.
Certified, yeah. And that's HACCP certifications and those kinds of things. And are they truly independent, or is there risk that some of those bodies are conflicted, whether it's big pharmaceutical companies or pesticide companies or other industries, or really, truly, are they independent?
From what I can tell, they are. They do their own research, and they're not really influenced. No one really holds stake in them. That's just from my own personal experience from working with them. But I mean, there could be shadow meetings that I'm not invited to.
No doubt there is conflict at some point. I want to talk a little bit about the founding principles of what goes to creating, and let's, use our facility here. We're a meat wholesaler, and we have an enormous volume that goes through this facility, and we take QA and all those things incredibly seriously. But I'd be really interested from your perspective around what you consider to be best practice in creating a culture around that, insofar as from the philosophy, from senior management all the way through to the qualifications of QA people, through to policies and procedures and those things. I'll just start with that if it's okay.
Yeah. So I think it's a huge buzz phrase right now is food safety culture. And so we've been talking about this for the last few years in the center that I work in. And, how can you improve your company's food safety culture? And how can you make your employees, the people who are coming into contact with these products, really care about making the best product that they can? Because not everyone loves their job. So no matter where you are, you'll have those people who...
It's hard, Hannah. Take context of our facility here. We have 60 people working downstairs that start work from midnight till 3 o'clock in the morning and work in a cold box.
Yep.
And it's hard. It's physically hard, both the time, the conditions, the volume, the pressure and all those things. So you're right. That's the starting point of difficultness.
Yeah. So you have to kind of start with someone who cares. Maybe they don't love it, but they care enough about it. And so I think, and a lot of times in, like you said, in big producing facilities and packing plants and, you're struggling just to get enough people to begin with. So that's always a problem. But if you can get people and you can kind of foster this knowledge-based program or something so that they can kind of see the effects of what happens when, you're not careful and you don't care about the safety of something. You don't, you went in with a pen and you left without it and you don't know what happened to it. That kind of thing, that can end up in someone's food. It can end up, hurt, downstream effects in their gut, anything. And so you have to really think about that. And so we have a conference every year that we're part of, the Fresh Produce Safety Center Conference, and
at Sydney University.
So that's the center that I am in. It's an Australian Research Council funded center where we're partnered with industry partners and research, and so we try to come together. It's called the Industrial Transformation Training Center for
sounds impressive.
Food safety and fresh produce. So it's a long name. But basically, we work with industry partners in fresh produce, so growers, packers, retailers, to try and address these scientifically and industrially important points of research that really need clarification or there's just no information on it. So in one of the conferences, we had the manager from One Harvest, which is a big salad packing company.
Yeah.
And he was telling this story of a Band-Aid in a salad. And he kind of went through, it was like at the time, it seemed very graphic. You were like, I'm eating and there's a Band-Aid in a salad.
Yeah.
But then he went down and kind of linked it like, oh, well, what if, you were at a barbecue and you're celebrating your daughter's 5th birthday and you have the salad and your daughter goes to take a bite and there's a Band-Aid. And then you'd go, all these thoughts go through your head, like, whose Band-Aid was that? What's on it? Everything. And so I think that was a very in-your-face way to, bring up the point of you have to always consider the end user.
Yeah.
And it's not about just going in, doing your job, however, and leaving. But what you do when you're in charge of food safety, when you're in charge of QA, QC, affects everyone. So it affects anyone who's going to buy that product that you approved.
Yeah.
And so it really helps for people to just have that kind of context. And I think what also helps is just that giving them the scientific knowledge that they need to understand it. And it doesn't need to be complex. It doesn't need to be courses. It doesn't need to be formal, but just kind of that knowledge of, okay, well, if I don't wash my hands after I go to the bathroom, then I have all these bacteria on my hand. And if I go straight into the packing plant or go even into the field and pick stuff, whatever's on my hand is going to get on that. And then what gets on that, if it's not, knocked off during rinsing or in the packing process,
gets consumed.
Yeah. And so it's really about putting it all together from when that point, even on farm, the point that seed's planted until someone eats it.
It's interesting. I used to sit on the ambassadors board of Surfaid, which is a big non-for-profit in Sumatra, where the Boxing Day tsunami came through. And Dr. Dave, the founder of that organization, because initially it started on the back of him going on a surf trip, going onto the islands and seeing all these young kids dying incredibly young of malaria. And so they started with a program that was all around malaria, and dysentery was the other big one. And they tried all the traditional teaching methods, etc. And then one, they didn't really get the language, but two, they realized that telling people things that are just knowledgeable wasn't teaching them. So he literally used to go and put shit on his hands and put it near his mouth to explain to the kids when they didn't wash their hands. That was effectively what they were doing. And instantly, overnight, the uptake of people washing their hands went through the ceiling. Because we try really hard here, but I think this is what we get fundamentally wrong, is we're trying to just impart the facts rather than imparting the message. The message,
Yeah.
The Band-Aid one with your daughter is one that I won't forget.
Yeah.
And I think we need
very
to.
graphic.
Yeah, it's really graphic, but we don't teach. Well, we typically don't teach like that.
Yeah, it's more about not knowing, if listeria gets on your meat, it will survive for X amount of days at this temperature. No, it's about if listeria gets on your meat and someone eats it and they're pregnant, then they could have a spontaneous abortion. They could really feel bad health effects. Like we need to, and listeria is one of those things that's usually everywhere. It's an environmental organism.
Yeah.
Just like E. coli, or anything else that really makes you sick. So in a food safety context.
Yeah.
But it's more about why we do this. Why are we so, militant about hand washing and changing gloves and wearing hairnets and
taking fingernails,
no
and
nail polish, no jewelry, tying
Yep.
your hair back.
Yeah.
It's to protect this product and in turn protect the health of the consumer who's going to buy this product.
Yeah. Do you think you have to adopt a draconian attitude to it? Or, because the whole anecdotal teaching, I get, but sometimes to me it feels like unless you become militant with it and people understand that it's not negotiable and it's probably the most important thing in what we do as a business, and I mean us, but everyone that's in fresh food.
Definitely.
I think we're too soft on it, and I'd be super interested from a research perspective what you see around that.
I think I'm a little I don't know, I'm a little biased now because I wash my hands all the time and wipe things down, and just because I know.
Obsessive compulsive, or just because you know?
Just because I know.
Yeah.
But I think the way to it's a fine balance. You want to be really strict and militant, but you also want people to enjoy what they're doing, and you want them to be happy when they're at work. And so you have to find that blend where you're really implementing your strict policies on your PPE and your hand washing and, foreign objects and all of that.
Yeah.
But you don't want it to be the point where people are like, oh, I have to wash my hands again. You want people to be like, oh, I need to go wash my hands again.
Yeah.
It's all about that attitude.
Yeah, I get that's the attitude.
Yeah,
but
I think it's more, you can't just, it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
You have to assess what situation you're in and then go from there. People will respond differently. Some people respond really well to like a militant draconian style, like you were saying, and some do the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And so as long as different people are working together, it's never going to be one size fits all.
But maybe that's it. Maybe it's having graphic pictures of a 5-year-old girl eating a Band-Aid in a salad, as opposed to saying, Hannah, you didn't wash your hands. If you do that again, then you're fired. Yeah. Because people don't respond to that.
Yeah, and even that's not enough, because all it takes is one time not washing your hands and going back to even food prep, the whole Chipotle norovirus thing, that was from poor hand hygiene. And so it just takes that and boom, tons of people are sick. So we want it to be preemptive. You don't want to reprimand people for not doing something. You want to enforce people in positive reinforcement, basically. You want people to continue to do the right thing. So maybe it's, recognition programs that keep people motivated to do things.
Yeah.
Just because, as soon as it only takes one time, it only takes one mistake for just everything to go haywire.
Yeah, I get it. Hey, Louis, can you press that air conditioning button for me, please, ma'am? I want to talk a little bit about some of the high-profile cases, because this is something that's very dear to our heart. It's probably the wrong term of phrase, but something that we endured just before Christmas last year with a ham recall, where a batch of our unbelievably wonderful quality, expensive, highly sought after hams that we sell both through our retail store at Victor Churchill and to other high-end retail stores and restaurants, etc. 200 of the 2,500 hams that we sell at Christmas were recalled, and the negative impact on that and the stress on executives and our staff was extreme to the least, primarily on the back of the press getting hold of it and being sensational. So that's one case. The other was when I used to work in finance, Mrs. Crockett's Kitchen, which was bought by a private equity firm for, these figures are a little bit vague, but they bought it for $104 million. They made pre-packed salads for Coles and Woolies primarily. I think it was like 90% of their business. They had a listeria outbreak and Woolies dropped them on the spot. That business 2 years later was sold for $3 million.
Wow.
And then the third one that was super recent, just a couple of weeks ago, was Tyson Foods that recalled 5.4 million tons of chicken on the back of what I heard was 2. You're telling me it was now 6 identified pieces of metal in produce. And back to what we were talking about before, people want cheap food. People want good quality food. People want food safety. But there seems to be this incredible waste that goes on because of sensationalism, and the press in particular, in my eyes, are unbelievably immoral when it comes to these cases. And I know they've got a job to do, which is to sell papers. But what's your view on these recall programs where it seems to be the tiniest hint of an issue means that all produce gets recalled?
Yeah. So I'm of two minds. One, I hate seeing the waste, like you say, and it is sensationalized. But two, I would rather overestimate a risk than underestimate a risk and then have someone, be
Get
severely
sick.
injured or sick.
Sure.
And so it's really hard to choose between those two. And I think often companies choose to be conservative about it and to be a little overprotective, which
Of course.
I think,
is the right approach.
it is. And that's how you really protect public health. But, companies really take a fall from that. And so it's really about how they respond. And so companies that have outbreaks and they don't address them and they just dump all their product and that's it, I think those are the ones that usually don't do as well following an outbreak or an incident. Whereas companies that come back and, they address it and they make improvements and changes, and whether the public sees that or just the retailers who are buying, the product to stock the shelves see that.
Yeah.
I don't think that matters as much because for the most part, I think there is some trust where if someone sees a product in a retail, Kohl's or Woolies or something, they assume that, it's up to a certain standard. So
it's a big assumption.
It is. But, I do think a lot of people think that.
Yeah.
But also a lot of people think that if you buy it on the street corner, it's much better. And so it's just, But back to your question. So I am of the mind that I do think to overestimate and be conservative is the right call. But that's when technologies like something like blockchain would be really helpful because you can see exactly which batches in the chicken case, which batches of the chicken were all, which bags came from the same batch. And so those would be likely because they're all scanned. Blockchain, you can't tamper with it.
Yeah.
It's, and it's encrypted and it's safe. And so you can trust it. And I think that's another thing is there's not a lot of trust. And so that would be something that would help in a situation like that where they could recall the exact batches that came from that
and
lot.
Quarantine that batch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, with something like a physical contaminant like metal, it's not so much a risk that it's continually being put into the product, whereas something microbial is because it could be a worker, it could be machinery in a plant, like in a packing facility. It could have been on the product when it came into the facility and spread to other pieces of the product. So that's a little harder to trace. Control. But something like metal would be much easier to control with blockchain, where they know, okay, this bag was filled with X amount of grams of meat at this time from this lot. Yeah.
I know Walmart in the States have been an early adopter of I think they were the pioneer of it with IBM, with blockchain, with their mangoes initially. We've been working on it with PwC. Without doubt, the regulatory hurdles that we're going through to actually get this to a state, one, where it's commercially viable, but two, where we can actually use it. Are you aware whether here or probably more obviously in the US, where it has been adopted and it's having a really positive impact?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I know we've discussed trialing it in a research context in our center, but I can't think of any company that's actually effectively using it.
Because it was all the rage, and we had the people from PwC on the podcast, and we talk about it ad nauseum with our customers, and they love the whole idea of it. But we're now coming really close to 12 months since we started talking about it, and it doesn't feel like we're any closer to having a product that we can start to at least pilot. And then I think people start to go, you know what, it's another technology that doesn't have any benefit for me, the end consumer. Whereas I really do, if there's anything I've seen in the last 5 years that really has enormous benefit to virtually everyone in the food chain, from the premium growers, from a counterfeit perspective, through to companies like us that are truly into true food safety and food trust and those kinds of things, through to the peace of mind of the end consumer and also the experience of the end consumer. Because one of the things we've been working on with it is not just from a food safety perspective, but you can sit there having a beautiful piece of meat in a restaurant and scan that meat and not only find out what brand it is, what it was fed, whether it's ever broken cold chain, what the heart rate of the animal was when it died, but all sorts of video and marketing paraphernalia that will bring you closer to the experience of the provenance of the animal.
Yeah, I think personally that would be so cool, especially things like meat and coffee, tea, things that we consume every day. We don't really think about where it's from, but that would really, and meat grown in beautiful pastures and coffee in these beautiful tropical areas. You could see, like you said, a visual video or image of where it came from. And that would just be really cool for a consumer experience as well. And if they were worried about something, blockchain would be the perfect way to address it. If they were worried that, for allergens, it would be great if there was maybe some sort of contact with peanuts at any point for someone who has a peanut allergy. You go back and you look at that and you scan it and you see, okay, it never went into any factory that has peanuts or any tree nuts, so it's just something. Because, now allergens are labeled so much better than they used to be. But when you're buying, smaller companies or smaller lots, it might be different. And a lot of big companies have multiple factories and multiple products.
What stopped you guys from starting a research project on blockchain?
So I don't think we've ruled it out yet. We have a student and she's looking at supply chain management. Yeah. So she gets up, she drives all over the state. She's flown down to Victoria and she has trackers that measure, temperature and all of this. And so we've talked about implementing it into her project because that would be perfect. But it's still up in the air. Yeah. And we've discussed, blockchain a lot, just its usefulness and but as far as I know, none of our partners are using it either.
Yeah, so, no, we're not. We're certainly not aware.
Yeah, it's not very common. Right now.
I'm going to look up where IBM and Walmart are at with theirs because they were certainly, like, it was 2 years ago they were piloting this. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, and this is on a technology perspective too, is the whole alternative, particularly with protein, so plant-based meat and cell-based meat. Do you think from a food safety perspective, it's going to reduce risk, the fact that it's grown in a laboratory or a facility, or does it just sound like it's going to be cleaner? Because, this is one of the things, they started calling it clean meat at one stage, and then the industry got up in arms, fair enough, too, saying, well, does that mean all actual animals are dirty meat? But do you think that it fundamentally reduces the risk or not necessarily?
I think in some ways you could argue that it would. So, obviously one of the huge issues with ground beef is E. coli. And so that usually happens from the evisceration of the carcass. And so it's always in the gut of, pretty much every cow and every human. So, and then it somehow spreads, whether it's through a surface or it's on other pieces of meat that have been incorporated into the ground beef mix. It's just, but so you you go into most ground beef thinking, okay, I need to cook this properly. Whereas a nice steak, you want to eat that rare.
Yeah.
And so it's just, they're from different parts of the cow and they encounter, different interfaces. Whereas, the cell-based meat, you would take that out, but you would also put a lot of trust in the person growing those cells, that they were following standard cell culture procedures, they weren't contaminating it themselves. So I think it just adds, and especially like mass production, I don't know how they would do. I work in cell culture, that's how we tell if viruses are infectious or not. And it would just be very labor intensive, just a lot of hard work around the clock to grow. I'm thinking to replace all the meat that we consume, even just in Australia, with cell-based. It's just nuts right now. And so, but replacing something natural, so like an animal, they know how to take care of themselves. They know how they need to eat. They need to drink, with a human who's going in and supplementing these cells with media until they grow up. And I don't know. It seems really weird to me. I don't think I would personally buy it.
Yeah.
But I can't separate food from the lab. So anything from a lab, I'm just inherently trained you don't eat or drink anything from the lab. And so come with food that has been grown in the lab.
I get that, but I do think there's two trains of thought. There's either that one, or you go, is it any different to an IVF baby that, 50 years ago, the thought of in vitro fertilization was horrendous to most people. And yet today, most people you ask know someone that's had a baby or multiple babies from IVF. So if we fast forward 5 or 10 years and the adoption's there and the risks have been proven to be minimal and all those kinds of things, well, we just look at it like any other technology, that it's not a cell-based meat. It's actually just meat grown in a different format, not using the natural environment.
I have no idea.
I don't either, because I still can't get my head around it. It's an interesting
comparison. I would have never thought to compare IVF to, a cell-cultured meat. I think it's similar, but to me, I still see it as like IVF. You're still
putting it back into a human.
It's still in a natural system and it produces a living thing, whereas the cell-cultured meat, it's just basically duplicating this cell over and over and over and over and over again until you get a substantial amount of tissue.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. It's a little strange.
And are we messing with nature? That whole thing. IVF babies typically result in twins or quads, and what are the ramifications of that for stuff that we're consuming?
Yeah, well, I don't think we'll ever be able to replace meat. I mean, in developing countries, we may have the luxury eventually to choose from, naturally raised meat or cell-based meat.
Yeah.
But in the underdeveloped world, that's not going to be it. It's domestication of animals and growing them and rearing them and husbandry is like part of culture as well.
So it's healthy. It's part of nature. And the way we look at it is, whether it's cell-based or plant-based, that if that can develop to the point where we can unwind the factory farming in particular and replace that, which, you know, is a significant portion of many, not a significant portion of what we do, but certainly a significant portion of what the mass producers and the big supermarkets are doing. But take that out and then have native farming, so native animals. You know, in this country, it's an abundant resource that is very underutilized, and then have sustainable farming practices that go back to natural principles of looking after the land and rotating and polyculture and all of those kinds of things, then that would be a brilliant outcome. But if you listen to the guys that are the vegan pioneers of this industry, like Brian Friedrich, who's part of the Good Food Institute in the US, that really has been at the forefront and does amazing work. I love the guy. I think he's fantastic. But he has this view that we can replace 100% of animal production with plant-based and cell-based meat. And I just question him around, what do you think happened to all those animals? Do they all just die slowly and painfully of old age? What do they live off? All of these kind of questions that I think the hysteria that's going around, you know, and Beyond Meat, the plant-based meat company that listed on the NASDAQ last week at $3.7 billion. You know, it's just almost like cryptocurrency was 4 years ago. Everyone wants to be part of it. Everyone from Tyson Foods through to Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, and everyone's riding this horse because it's really topical. And I'm just not sure that it's as viable or it's as good for the planet, the animals, and us humans as everyone believes it is.
Well, I mean, when you think about in pasture, cattle turn over the land too. You know, they're making it fertile, they're making it productive.
Of course.
It's a natural cycle, like you said. And I think a lot of people just, when they think of animal agriculture, they automatically think of feedlots and, you know, the broiler chickens that have grown, 20 kilos over what they should be. And,
of course.
And it's not the case, especially nowadays. There's, in Australia's a really good example. I don't think I've seen a single feedlot since I've been here.
Yeah. There are definitely feedlots.
Yeah. But
they're very not ethical feedlots. Like, they're not like what people watch when they watch Cowspiracy or What the Health or these very sensational documentaries that are really mischievous in what they present.
They are. And they don't, stuff like, people taking their iPhone video undercover. They're not really,
context.
No, there's no context. Yeah. And so you see those videos of the mother hog separated from the piglets. And it's like, well, actually the mother was more than likely to lay on them and, suffocate them. That happens a lot in confined, or, not confined, but in smaller spaces. And it's not like these animals are restrictive. And, it's just, you just see certain things, or maybe they just see, a feeding time when, the mother is stood up and the piglets go to wean. And it's just, you're not seeing what's actually happening.
Yeah.
And so that's a huge thing. Like, it's fine if people want to be vegan and vegetarian, but I just think people should always be informed as to their principles and why. And they shouldn't just see a video online and then immediately decide that everyone in the meat industry is evil. Everyone in the dairy industry is evil.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so it's not all bad. And I think because we have grown and we have more research about the way animals react to certain things, we have more research about antibiotics and antibiotic resistance. And so all of that is being phased into regulation now. And so animals are treated, in the modern world, probably better than they have been.
They're treated better than humans.
Yeah.
I would argue anyone that hasn't been to a sustainable farm, an ethically practiced farm needs to go before they start.
They're amazing.
It's incredible. Like some of the farms of our suppliers are mind-blowingly beautiful insofar as how they're run. And like one in particular, Marima Dux, who's a young guy who 3 years ago he was an electrician. And his dad died, left him some money, and his dream was, because his dad was a policeman that hated every minute of it, and his dad said, go and do what you want to do. And he took his wife and 2 young children and went and started this farm. And there is not one chemical in their farmhouse, let alone on their farm. The pigs plough the lands. They rotate the ducks every day. There's beef. It's just this wonderful, happy place. And the produce that comes out of there is amazing. And the yields that they get from that farm are amazing, you know, and they counteract this whole thing around factory farming in particular, that it's the only way that we can feed the 9.7 billion people that we're going to have on this planet in 2050 is by intensive farming, factory farming. Well, that's what
destroyed the environment to begin with. Monoculture, you know, we lost all of our species diversity. We lost like different nutrients from soils. And so that's what kind of started it, I would say.
And a big part of that is crops. It's not,
it's not necessarily animals.
It's not animals. And crops, admittedly, that are grown for human and animal consumption. But again, back to what we were talking about before, I so respect everyone's right to be vegan, vegetarian, whatever they want to be. The thing that I object to is that they don't know the whole story. That if you're going to be this advocate for change, whether it's driven by animals, whether it's driven by humans, whether it's driven by the environment, then you need to dig a whole lot deeper. You know, start looking at the fashion industry, start looking at the transport industry, start looking at the energy industry, because you can't just look at the agricultural industry in isolation.
No, it's not just agriculture that is, you know, bad for the environment right now. Everything we're doing as a human society is pretty bad for the environment right now.
Too many of us. Stop breeding people. Like if you really want
calm
to
down, everybody.
Stop drinking and having unprotected sex.
But yeah, I mean, it's more about how can we fix what's already been done. You know, we can't go back in time and stop monoculture, you know, agriculture. And like you said, factory farming probably isn't the way of the future. It's probably, you know, for the better of the earth, it's going to be phased out. And, you know, and I think, excuse me, there have been farms that are trialing planting crops of similar species together to try and help that fertility. I think, you know, it makes sense. People are a little hesitant because they don't want to try something risky and, you know, lose their livelihood. So I think that's where like scientific researchers come in, and how can we kind of turn back the clock a little bit onto what's already been done.
Yeah, but that's the irony of they don't want to risk their livelihood. And again, back to that True Cost documentary, which again was around the cotton growers primarily because it was all about fashion. But in India, where so many of these farmers were, 250,000 farmers have taken their life over the course of the last 5 years. And it's all on the back of Monsanto selling them these genetically modified crops, saying that the yields are going to be enormously higher, and then they have to sell them the fertilizers on top of them. And, you know, they lend them the money to do that, and they get so indebted, and then the yields aren't as high as they want. And it's this vicious cycle of, so I'm not sure that the risk of going back to a natural way is anymore. In fact, I'm almost positive that it's going to be less for most people. But you're right, for the vast majority of them, they're on this course and they're not going to change it. And for a lot of primary producers, they are indebted to their eyeballs, and It's the only thing that they've got.
Yeah, it is a sad case study, I guess, when you think about the Monsanto Empire. You know, they have quite the monopoly over a lot of these seeds and fertilizers. And, you know, I want to say that it's not their intention to do the things they end up doing, putting people out of business or, taking their livelihood or causing people to take their lives.
Definitely not that. But it's selling seeds and fertilizer.
And just having that monopoly. And, I've heard of cases where farmers have seeds and they didn't renew a license for them. And so Monsanto takes them to court. And it's just stuff like that where, it's all very, I don't know, in the paperwork kind of, and people aren't necessarily worried about that. They're worried about going out and sowing their seeds and crops and taking care of that. And food safety on top of everything. And so they have enough to worry about than renewing their seed license.
Yeah. It was the most perverse vertical integration of all time when Bayer bought Monsanto. That will make people sick and then we can sell them the pharmaceutical to make them better.
Yeah, it's just when you sit back and you realize kind of really only a few major players control most of the world's food supply and, not even food supply, but like you said, cotton and, non-consumable crops. And so unfortunately, like you mentioned, India, as was the case study, is a lot of these underdeveloped countries, they're really taking the toll because they have less regulation than we have, or they have the regulation, but they don't have as many people to enforce it. Now that you mentioned India, I watched like a short documentary about mica mining in India, and the children are going into mines as early as 4 to mine this mica for the beauty industry. Mica's in every makeup product for the most part.
Wow.
And the kids are dying, and they're making, I think they said, the equivalent of a U.S. quarter, so 25 cents a day.
Yeah. And
they have to work, and it's just they're so born into this system that they have no other choice. And they're usually in rural, it's what did they call it? It's like commodity poor. So there was a term for it. Where basically they're blessed with these all these resource poor.
Yeah.
Blessed with all these natural resources in their area, but they're really disenfranchised because of it.
And the corporates say we're creating wealth for them. If we didn't give them a job, then they wouldn't have a job. And I go, but they're working in a sweatshop that collapses and 1,000 people die, or working with toxins that their children are disfigured. It doesn't seem like a fair deal.
No, and it's one thing to give people opportunities, but it's another to give them safe and, acceptable opportunities. And if the way you look at it is if they were running that business in Australia, that would not be the case.
Yeah.
And so that they intentionally run it in these disenfranchised countries because, they can pay them less. And maybe it's cheaper to maintain buildings because they don't need to inspect them as often. And I'm hoping that will we'll move away from that as people are becoming more and more aware of this happening. But I think we've known about the sweatshops and, like you mentioned, all of that for years, and it's still happening.
It doesn't change. You get, and I don't mean to pick on the fashion industry, but it's super relevant because you would think that the sweatshops that we heard about for decades would have gotten better, but then all of a sudden fast fashion came into fashion, and the generation that seemed to be so for the righteousness of everything are the ones that buy all these new clothes, and that goes back to, and I don't necessarily think that all of these people that are out there protesting against animals and things are necessarily shopping at H&M and Zara, but I dare say some of them haven't thought it through, or flying to London every year and not understanding the carbon impact of that and those kinds of things. But again, it's that if you're going to be this advocate, then you've got to take a holistic view, because otherwise you're just
it's not just one bad thing happening. There's
lots
tons
of them,
and they're all for the most part connected.
Yeah. How do we get more people doing what you're doing, taking the skills that you've got and bringing them into industry? Because we find it incredibly, painfully hard to find people to want to work in this industry, because I think it's misunderstood, or two, it's just not sexy enough. And they think that they are compliance as opposed to value add, whereas the philosophy that we're trying to sell here is that it's probably the most important value adding thing that we do, but it doesn't seem to be construed that way.
Yeah, exactly. Like you always want to think of food safety not as in compliance terms. You always hope that you're in compliance no matter what, and that you're really making the best product that you can. In, like you said, it's actually a value add. As far as getting people interested, and I think you have to make the message very relatable again. And I mean, for me, I kind of just like tripped and fell into getting a PhD. It wasn't my plan at all, but it was something where I learned more about, public health, environmental health. For me specifically, water quality is what I studied a lot of. And it's just this thing where, you just become so interested and you want to know, why is it like this? How can we, stop? For me, water as an example for water, how can we stop, sewage plant overflows into our waterways? How can we stop runoff from, contaminating our recreational rivers and lakes? And I mean, up until the 90s, there was untreated sewage going off Ben Buckler into Bondi Beach. And so, obviously those things aren't good. And so for me, it's just such an interest and a want to see change. I don't want anyone to become ill because they drank a glass of water from the tap.
Yeah.
And so, or because they ate a salad. So I think, and you have to really convey to like young people that, it's not just compliance. You're not just ticking a box. You're not just looking at something and say, oh, yes, no. Like it's part of a whole chain, a whole like sphere. It's its own world, this food science and food safety.
Yeah.
And that each person is important. It's like a little Lego, each person is the Lego block, and without one person, it all falls apart.
Yeah.
And so it's very important. It's vital. And I think also people seeing kind of like the practical side of it. So for me, when I was in public health, I did a few volunteer trips to India. And so there you really see that they don't have it like we have it. And so anything that we can do to make it better is helpful. And so you kind of get that like spark going.
Is your vision a global one, not just first world?
Hopefully. Yeah. So, I mean, for water quality, definitely. The first world, we still encounter so many different water quality and food safety problems, but it's an everyday in developing countries. I mean, there's some people who E. coli 0157, I'm sure most people have heard of that. It's a huge food contaminant. Some people, they're just regularly colonized with it. It's just in their gut. And so this organism, it doesn't just make you throw up or, give you diarrhea. It can cause huge long-term side effects. And we're finding out that people who have maybe had these, it could be it's called sequelae, which is like a long-term manifestation of symptoms of an infection that you had years before. So people are getting higher incidence of rheumatoid arthritis. And so this is all new, kind of like a new field. But, so these people's quality of life are being impacted every single day. And it's just, again, it's an obligatory risk. You have to drink water. You have to eat food. So what are you going to do about it? Just stop? And they can't afford to buy bottled water. So they can, they're stuck with what they have.
Yeah.
And so we have to try and fix that as much as we can, or help them. Maybe not necessarily fix it, but help them, give them the tools that they can develop it on their own.
Yeah. It's a big one, because even the bottled water thing, I mentioned to you before we came on that I've just come back from Cuba, and water there is you obviously can't drink it. It's putrid. But then they've got bottled water that's, one, it's expensive for an incredibly poor country, and two, because they just don't understand the ramifications of what happens to that plastic when it gets into their waterways, is that the country is becoming so quickly polluted from the plastic that it's creating a whole nother problem insofar as their waterways and the one thing that they have, being the tourist industry, is being destroyed. So the education that goes with the means of giving them clean water has to all go together.
It's all tied. Yeah.
It's all tied.
What a lot of the research going on, public health research for food safety and water quality and just overall public health, are installing like water purification systems. And it's not like the really nice, 10 component purification system people have in their kitchen, say in the US or in Australia. It's super basic, but it's just designed to filter out parasites and some bacteria. Sometimes they have, different types of treatment that they give them, like devices. So something that has been trialed in the past is like UV light disinfection for water. And so what happens is people go out with these great intentions and they go to underdeveloped countries and they give them these tools, but that's it. As soon as they leave, they don't know what to do. The population doesn't know what to do with them, or they don't know what to do when it breaks, or they don't know what to do when they run out of something, and everyone's just gone. And so, like, for water quality, we've been trying different kind of longer term, more sustainable. So, like, foot pumps for pumping groundwater out for drinking, as opposed to, taking water from the stream. And so I have a lot of colleagues in the US mostly who do a lot of work in Africa. Yeah. And they look at water quality for irrigation for fresh produce on like small farms in small communities. And so, because, they're drinking the same water that they're farming with, that they're bathing in. Most small underdeveloped communities have one water source, because water isn't an abundant resource anymore. It's pretty hard to come by.
Yeah.
So people are kind of just dealing with what they have. And a lot of people get sick from it. So it's just about kind of creating these interventions that are sustainable and long-term in these areas where there might not be someone to reinforce it.
It's a big problem.
It is.
Hannah Sassi, it's a big problem.
It is.
Hey, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. It's something we want to bring you back, because I do think this connection between what's happening at this level and what's happening at a research level and what's happening at a governing body level, we don't do a good job of bringing all that together. And, back to how do we attract good people into the industry? How do we get people like you imparting your knowledge? Obviously this is one way of doing it, but I think that what I've learned from you in an hour is probably more knowledge than we've imparted to our team in a year. And
thank you.
So we do need to get better at how we're getting people to understand the ramifications of their actions.
Yeah, it's so important. If you don't know why you're doing something, you're not going to care about doing it or doing it well. It's all about that end result. And so, I say that for my research, I always think about, maybe I think a little too long term, but, how is this going to impact everyone? Not just how can I win this grant or how can I get this job? No, it's how can I do something that will begin to create change that's sustainable? Yeah. And so that's true in food safety too. We just really need to keep a sustained culture of people who care about what they're doing and who know why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, but that's an interesting philosophy. Like there's that great TED talk about thinking long term, where these kinds of problems, if you truly want to have an impact, you've got to think multi-generational.
Yeah, definitely.
And I do think food safety and food security, and obviously water ties into that, are those problems that if we don't have that multi-generational view, then we're probably not going to move the needle, and our children and grandchildren and things are in for a hell of a time.
Definitely. Same goes for climate too.
A whole nother conversation.
A whole nother hour.
Awesome. Thank you again, Hannah. It's been amazing.
It's been great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.